The shadow of Martha Townsend's funeral continued to darken Florence Turner's doorstep long after they'd lowered her sister into the hard Montana soil. Florence stood at her kitchen window, staring at the rolling prairie beyond her small homestead, the morning sun catching the tears that refused to stop falling. 6 months a widow herself, and now without the only family she had left in the world. The year was 1876, and White Rock, Montana was still more promised than Proper Town. Florence had arrived with her husband Charles 3 years earlier, full of dreams that withered faster than their first attempt at crops. When the consumption took Charles last winter, Florence had clung to Martha's presence in town, her sister's weekly visits the only thing keeping her from giving up entirely. A knock at the door startled her from her grief. Florence wiped her eyes hastily with her apron, smoothed her simple black dress, and tucked a strand of auburn hair back into her bun before opening the door. Sheriff Wyatt Danner stood on her porch, hat in hand, but no sympathy in his weathered face. At 45, the man had been running White Rock since before it had an official name, and his opinion carried the weight of law. "Mrs. Turner," he said with a curt nod, "I've come to discuss your situation." Florence gripped the doorframe. "What situation would that be, Sheriff?" "Your property. This homestead." He glanced past her into the modest cabin Charles had built. "Town's growing. Can't have prime land sitting fallow because a widow can't manage it." Florence felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I'm managing just fine." The sheriff's laugh was cold. "Are you now? Your fields are overgrown. No livestock to speak of. No crops planted. You've been living off your sister's charity, and now she's gone." "I'm in mourning, Sheriff. I buried Martha yesterday. Mourning doesn't put food on the table or make this land productive." His eyes narrowed. "The town council's concerned. A worthless claim like this hurts progress." The word stung worse than a slap. "Worthless? That's what I said." Sheriff Danner placed his hat back on his head. "I've got interested parties willing to take this place off your hands. Give you enough to get back east where a woman alone belongs." "This is my home," Florence said, her voice stronger than she felt. "My husband and I claimed this land legally. And what would your husband think of how you've let it go?" The sheriff shook his head. "You've got 2 weeks to show some improvement, or I'll be back with papers for you to sign. For your own good, of course." As the sheriff turned to leave, Florence noticed a man standing by the fence, watching the exchange. Tall and broad-shouldered, he leaned against a chestnut horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. The sheriff noticed him too. "What business you got here, stranger?" The man straightened, and Florence could now see his face tanned by the sun, with keen blue eyes and a strong jawline softened by a neatly trimmed beard. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice deep and steady. "Thought I might ask about work." Sheriff Danner snorted. "There's no work here. This place is practically abandoned." The stranger's eyes met Florence's, and she felt an unexpected warmth in his gaze. "Doesn't look abandoned to me." "Well, it soon will be," the sheriff said. "Mrs. Turner here can't manage on her own. Land this good needs a man's touch." The stranger walked closer, and Florence noticed the easy confidence in his stride. "Is that right?" he asked, looking directly at Florence rather than the sheriff. Florence lifted her chin. "The sheriff believes I'm worthless without a husband." The stranger's expression hardened as he turned to Danner. "That's so." He looked back at Florence, his gaze taking in her homestead, the overgrown fields, and finally returning to her face with surprising intensity. "From where I'm standing, she looks like my whole world." Sheriff Danner's face reddened. "You don't even know her." "I know disrespect when I hear it," the stranger replied, his hand resting casually near the pistol on his hip. "And I know good land when I see it." The sheriff stepped back, reassessing the situation. "Just who are you, mister?" "Name's Colton Murphy." He touched the brim of his hat. "Recently of the Colorado Territory." "Well, Murphy, this is town business. Best you move along." Colton didn't budge. "I'm looking for honest work, and it seems the lady might need help getting her place in order." He looked at Florence. "If she's willing, that is." Florence knew she should be cautious with this stranger, but something in his steady gaze gave her courage. And practically speaking, she did need help if she was going to keep her land. "I could use an extra pair of hands," she said. "For fair wages, of course." Sheriff Danner scowled. "This doesn't change anything." 2 weeks, Mrs. Turner." Show progress or sell. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Florence and Colton watched him go, standing in awkward silence until he was out of sight. I can't actually pay you much, Florence admitted once they were alone. The sheriff wasn't wrong about everything. I've been struggling. Colton removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with gold from the sun. I didn't offer my help expecting riches, Mrs. Turner. I've been on the trail a while, looking for somewhere to settle. A roof and meals would be fair exchange for my labor, at least to start. Florence studied him carefully. Why would you say that? About me being your whole world? You don't know me at all. A smile crossed his face, softening his features. Because I could see it bothered him. And because no one deserves to be called worthless, especially not by someone who should be protecting the townsfolk. He extended his hand. I promise I'm not in the habit of making declarations to women I've just met. Despite everything, Florence found herself smiling back as she shook his hand. Florence Turner. Pleased to meet you properly, Mrs. Turner. Just Florence is fine. She hesitated, then added, My husband's been gone 6 months now. Colton nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'm sorry for your loss. And I heard about your sister too. That's a heavy burden. Florence felt the grief rising again and turned away quickly. There's a small room off the barn you can use. It's not much, but it's dry. More than I've had in weeks, Colton said. I'll get my things and start looking over what needs doing most urgently. As he walked back to his horse, Florence wondered if she was making a terrible mistake trusting a stranger. But with the sheriff's threat hanging over her head and no one else to turn to, what choice did she have? The first days with Colton Murphy on her homestead passed in a blur of activity. Florence woke at dawn to find him already at work, repairing the chicken coop that had fallen into disrepair after Charles's death. By midday, he had reinforced the fence around what had once been their vegetable garden. The soil's good. He told her over the simple lunch of cornbread and beans she'd prepared. We can get some crops and right away quick-growing things like radishes and lettuce. Won't be much, but it'll show the sheriff you're working the land. You know farming? Florence asked. Colton nodded. Grew up on a farm in Missouri before the war. Afterwards, I tried my hand at ranching in Colorado, but the winters were harsh, and the company wasn't to my liking. And what brought you to Montana? He seemed to consider his words carefully. A man gets to a point where he's tired of wandering. I heard there was good land up this way, places a man might put down roots. There was more to his story, Florence suspected, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss. On the third day, Colton rode into town and returned with 2 young goats, feed, seeds, and supplies. Florence stood in shock as he unloaded everything. How did you pay for all this? She asked. I had some savings, he said simply. Consider it an investment in our mutual future. If this place prospers, we both benefit. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple, Florence found herself studying her unexpected savior. His hands were strong but gentle as he whittled a small piece of wood. The past few days had revealed him to be hard-working, knowledgeable, and respectful of her space and grief. Why did you really stop that day? She asked suddenly. When the sheriff was here? Colton's hand stilled. Truth, please. I was riding past and heard how he spoke to you. Reminded me of men I've known who think a woman alone is somehow less than. He set down his whittling. My mother raised 4 boys after my father died in the war with Mexico. She was the strongest person I've ever known, but the townspeople treated her like she was broken without a man. I swore I'd never stand by and watch that happen if I could help it. Florence felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you for stopping. Don't thank me yet. We've still got to show that sheriff what you're capable of. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Florence was collecting eggs from the newly repaired coop when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart sank when she recognized Margaret Wells, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of White Rock. Florence, dear, Margaret called, dismounting with the help of her young stable boy. I've come to check on you. We're all so concerned. Florence straightened her apron and tried to smile. That's very kind, Margaret. But as you can see, I'm managing. Margaret's eyes darted around, taking in the repairs and improvements. Yes, I can see someone's been busy. Sheriff Danner mentioned you'd taken in a drifter. Mr. Murphy is working for me, helping restore the farm. Is that what they're calling it these days? Margaret's eyebrows rose. A widow living alone with a strange man. People are talking, Florence. Before Florence could respond, Colton emerged from the barn, leading a horse he'd been grooming. He nodded politely to the visitor. Mrs. Wells, Florence said stiffly, this is Colton Murphy. He's been kind enough to help me get the farm back in working order. Margaret assessed him with undisguised suspicion. I'm sure you have only the purest intentions, Mr. Murphy. Just trying to earn my keep, madam, Colton replied evenly. Well, Margaret sniffed. The Ladies' Aid Society feels it would be more appropriate if Florence returned to town. We could find her suitable accommodations and proper employment, perhaps as a seamstress or schoolteacher. Florence felt her temper rising. This is my home, Margaret. I have no intention of abandoning it. But dear, a woman alone, she's not alone, Colton interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. She is help, and she has every right to keep what she and her husband built. Margaret's lips thinned. I see. Well, don't say we didn't try to help when the scandal becomes too much to bear. She turned to Florence. The offer remains open, should you come to your senses. After Margaret departed, Florence sank onto the porch steps, trembling with anger and humiliation. I'm causing you problems, Colton said, sitting beside her but keeping a respectful distance. They were already looking for reasons to drive me out, Florence replied. If it wasn't you, it would be something else. Still, maybe I should sleep in town. No, Florence said firmly. I won't let their gossip dictate my decisions. You've done more to help me in 3 days than any of them did in 6 months of widowhood. Colton studied her face. You're stronger than they give you credit for. I wasn't always, she admitted. After Charles died, I could barely get out of bed some days. Martha would come and practically force food down my throat. Her voice broke. I don't know what I would have done without her. Grief takes its own time, Colton said softly. No one has the right to rush you through it. The compassion in his voice unlocked something in Florence, and before she could stop herself, tears were streaming down her face. Months of bottled grief poured out as she told him about Charles, about their dreams for this land, about Martha's unwavering support, and finally about the crushing loneliness of being the last one left. Colton listened without interruption, offering his handkerchief when her tears overwhelmed her. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the emotional release, he spoke carefully. My wife Sarah died in childbirth 6 years ago, he said, his voice rough with old pain. Our son with her. For a long time, I thought I'd died too, just hadn't figured out how to fall down yet. Florence looked up at him through tear-swollen eyes. What changed? Time. Work. Eventually, I realized I could either join them in death or find a way to honor them in life. He looked out at the land spreading before them. This place, it could be something good. Something that would have made your husband proud. Charles always said this land had a soul, Florence whispered. That if we cared for it properly, it would care for us in return. Smart man, Colton said with a small smile. Let's prove him right. The next week passed in a blur of backbreaking work. Colton repaired the barn roof, cleared the irrigation ditches, and helped Florence plant a vegetable garden. Together they cleaned out the root cellar and repaired fences. Florence found herself growing stronger each day, both physically and emotionally. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, too tired for much conversation, but sharing a comfortable silence. Sometimes Colton would tell stories of his travels, the majestic mountains of Colorado, the vast plains of Kansas, the bustling riverboats of the Mississippi. Florence found herself sharing memories to her childhood in Pennsylvania, the journey west with Charles, their first winter in the cabin. On the day before Sheriff Danner's deadline, Florence surveyed their progress with pride. The homestead looked alive again. Chickens scratched in their pen, goats grazed in a small paddock, and neat rows of newly sprouted vegetables lined the garden. Colton had even managed to repair the wagon Charles had been working on when he fell ill. We've done it, she said, amazed by the transformation. Colton, who was splitting wood nearby, paused and leaned on his axe. You've done it, Florence. This is your victory. I couldn't have without your help, she insisted. He shrugged, but she could see the satisfaction in his eyes. The sheriff won't have any grounds to pressure you now. What will you do? Florence asked, suddenly realizing she hadn't considered what would happen after the deadline passed. Will you move on? Something flickered in Colton's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. That depends. On what? He set the axe down and walked toward her. On whether there's still work to be done here. On whether I'm still needed. Florence felt her heart quicken. There's always work on a farm. That's not what I'm asking, Colton said softly. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Sheriff Danner rode up, accompanied by Harold Wells, the banker, and James Blackwell, the town's wealthiest landowner. Right on schedule, Colton muttered, moving to stand beside Florence as the men dismounted. Sheriff Danner looked genuinely surprised as he took in the improvements. Well now, this is unexpected. As you can see, Sheriff, my farm is doing just fine, Florence said, lifting her chin. Harold Wells frowned. A few chickens and some lettuce doesn't make a viable operation. It's a start, Colton countered, and more than enough to satisfy the homestead requirements. James Blackwell, a corpulent man with cold eyes, spoke up. Mrs. Turner, be reasonable. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for this land. $300 more than generous considering the circumstances. Florence gasped. The amount was insultingly low for 160 acres with a house, barn, and working well. This land is not for sale, Mr. Blackwell. You should consider the offer, Sheriff Danner said. A woman alone, she's not alone. Colton interrupted, his voice hard. And the land is clearly being worked. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. And what exactly is your stake in this, Murphy? Far as I can tell, you're just passing through. I've been hired as Mrs. Turner's farm manager, Colton replied smoothly. We have a contract. This was news to Florence, but she didn't contradict him. A contract? Harold Wells asked skeptically. May we see it? It's a private business arrangement, Florence said, finding her voice. But I can assure you it's all proper and legal. James Blackwell's face reddened. This is absurd. The town needs this land for expansion. We're prepared to invoke eminent domain if necessary. On what grounds? Colton challenged. The homestead is active and productive. Mrs. Turner has broken no laws. There are other considerations, Sheriff Danner said darkly. Questions of moral character, for instance. A widow living alone with an unrelated man. If you're implying something improper, Florence cut in, her voice shaking with anger. You should state it plainly, Sheriff. Otherwise, I believe our business is concluded. The tension stretched between them like a bowstring pulled too tight. Finally, the sheriff turned to his horse. This isn't over, he warned. The town council will be discussing this matter further. After the men departed, Florence released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you for standing with me. Colton's expression was troubled. They won't give up easily. Blackwell wants this land, and men like him are used to getting what they want. Why would he want my farm so badly? Location, I'd guess. You're close to town, but control access to the creek. Valuable position. Colton hesitated. About what I said the contract, it was quick thinking, Florence said. Though we should probably draw something up, just in case they ask again. Is that what you want? For me to stay on as your farm manager? Florence looked around at the homestead, coming back to life under their joint efforts. I want to keep what Charles and I built. I want to make this place thrive again. She met his eyes. And yes, I want you to stay. But not just as an employee. Colton stepped closer, his expression guarded. What are you saying, Florence? I'm saying that in just 2 weeks, you've become important to me. More than important. She took a deep breath. I know it's fast and probably foolish, but I feel alive again when you're near. Colton took her hands in his touch gentle. There's nothing foolish about finding connection after loss. I feel it too. But we should be careful. For your sake. His thumbs traced circles on her palms. The town already gossips. If we give them more reason. I don't care what they think, Florence said with sudden fierceness. They left me to grieve alone, left me to fail. You're the only one who saw value in me when everyone else called me worthless. You were never worthless, Colton said, his voice low and intense. From the moment I saw you standing up to that sheriff, I knew you were extraordinary. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space between heartbeats. When they separated, Florence felt a sense of rightness settle over her, like coming home after a long journey. We'll face whatever comes together, Colton promised. The following Sunday, Florence entered the small white church in White Rock with Colton at her side. Heads turned, and whispers followed as they took seats near the back. Florence kept her eyes forward, even as she felt Margaret Wells's disapproving stare boring into the back of her head. Reverend Phillips gave a sermon about judgment and forgiveness that seemed pointed enough to make Florence wonder if he'd chosen it specifically for the occasion. As the congregation filed out afterward, Florence braced herself for the inevitable confrontations. "Mrs. Turner," Margaret Wells said, intercepting them on the church steps. "How brave of you to join us today. We come to worship, same as everyone," Colton replied evenly. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course, though some might question the sincerity of those who flout convention so openly. Before Florence could respond, an elderly woman pushed through the small crowd gathering around them. "That's quite enough, Margaret," said Ida Johnson, the town's midwife and oldest resident. "I don't recall the good book saying anything about abandoned widows being sinful for accepting help." "Mrs. Johnson, this goes beyond help," Margaret began. "Does it now?" Ida turned to Florence. "Is this man treating you well, child?" "Yes, madam," Florence answered. "Mr. Murphy has been nothing but respectful and hard-working." "And he makes you smile again," Ida observed. "First time I've seen that since before Charles took ill." She faced the onlookers. "Shame on all of you for your gossip. When my Albert died 30 years ago, this town rallied around me. Now you persecute a young widow for finding some comfort? What would your mothers say?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably under Ida's stern gaze. "Mr. Murphy," Ida continued, turning to Colton, "are your intentions toward Mrs. Turner honorable?" Colton met her eyes without flinching. "Yes, madam. Completely." "Well then," Ida announced loudly, "I for one welcome you to our community. Now, Florence dear, will you and Mr. Murphy join me for Sunday dinner? My grandson brought venison, and I've made too much for just myself." The invitation, delivered in front of the entire congregation, was a public endorsement that not even Margaret Wells could counter. Florence accepted gratefully, sensing a shift in the air around them. Not everyone was won over, but Ida Johnson's approval carried weight. As they walked to Ida's small house near the edge of town, Florence whispered to Colton, "Thank you for coming today. I know church isn't everyone's comfort." "I've found my faith again recently," he replied quietly. "Some might say it found me, on a dusty road outside a certain homestead." Ida Johnson proved to be as formidable an ally as she was a hostess. Over a generous dinner, she extracted Colton's life story with the skill of a seasoned interrogator, nodding approvingly at his answers. "Colorado, you say? My nephew ranches near Denver. Perhaps you knew him, Samuel Johnson?" "Can't say that I did, madam," Colton replied. "Colorado's a big place." "Indeed it is." Ida served him another helping of potatoes. "And what exactly brought you to our little corner of Montana?" Colton glanced at Florence before answering. "I was heading to the gold fields up north when I passed through. Fate had other plans, it seems." "Fate," Ida repeated thoughtfully. "Or Providence." She turned to Florence. "He's a good man, dear. I can see it in his eyes. But be careful, Blackwell and the sheriff won't give up easily. They've been planning something with that land of yours for months." "What do you mean?" Florence asked. "Railroad's coming," Ida said simply. "Those who know where the line will run stand to profit handsomely. Your land sits right where they need to pass." Colton's expression darkened. "That explains the lowball offer." "Indeed it does." Ida poured more coffee. "They tried the same with old Willis Peters last year, but he was too stubborn to sell. Died in the winter, and suddenly his son couldn't wait to unload the property. Went to Blackwell for a fraction of its worth." "Are you suggesting foul play?" Florence asked, horrified. Ida shrugged. "I'm suggesting you watch yourselves. Blackwell didn't get rich by playing fair." The warning cast a shadow over their ride home. As the homestead came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Florence felt a surge of determination. This was her land, hers and Charles's dream. She wouldn't surrender it to men like Blackwell, no matter what schemes they concocted. "We should be prepared," Colton said as they unsaddled the horses. "If what Ida says is true, they won't stop at rumors and pressure. What can we do? Make it clear you're not alone." Colton's expression was serious. "Florence, I've been thinking about what Ida asked about my intentions." Florence's heart quickened. "Yes, I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a few weeks. But I haven't felt this way since Sarah." He took her hands in his. "I'm not proposing not yet. That would be too fast for both of us. But I want you to know that's where my heart is heading. Florence squeezed his hands. Mine too. Their second kiss was deeper than the first, filled with promise and growing affection. When they parted, Colton rested his forehead against hers. Whatever comes, we face it together. The next morning, Florence awoke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and found Colton working on the front porch, replacing worn boards. Early start, she commented, bringing him coffee. He accepted the cup gratefully. Thought I'd fix this before starting on the north fence. At this rate, we'll have the finest homestead in the territory by winter. Colton smiled. That's the plan. As the days passed, their routines settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for the hardest work repairing, planting, tending livestock. Afternoons often found Florence preserving vegetables or mending while Colton worked on longer-term projects. Evenings were for quiet conversations on the porch, sharing dreams and memories. Florence felt herself healing, the sharp edges of her grief softening. She still missed Charles and Martha, still visited their graves each Sunday after church, but the crushing weight of loss had lifted. In its place grew something new, something hopeful and green, like the shoots pushing through the soil in her garden. One evening, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Colton turned to her with unusual seriousness. I've been thinking about what Ida said about the railroad, he began. If they're determined to put the line through your property, they won't stop at underhanded tactics. Florence nodded. I've been worrying about that too. There might be a way to turn it to our advantage, Colton suggested. Instead of fighting them, what if we negotiated? Offer a right-of-way through the eastern corner for a price. Sell part of the land? Not sell lease. The railroad would pay for the privilege of crossing your property, but you'd retain ownership of the land. Florence considered this. Wouldn't that be giving Blackwell what he wants? Not exactly. He wants control of all your land. This way, you maintain control but profit from the railroad's need. Colton leaned forward. And with that income, we could really build something here, more livestock, better equipment, maybe even hire help during harvest. The way he said, we, warmed Florence's heart. It's worth considering, she agreed. But would the railroad deal with me directly, or would I have to go through Blackwell? That's what we need to find out. Colton looked thoughtful. There's a land office in Helena. They'd have information about the proposed route and who's authorized to negotiate rights of way. Helena's 3 days' journey each way, Florence pointed out. I could go, Colton offered. Get the information we need and be back within the week. The thought of Colton leaving, even temporarily, filled Florence with unease. What if something happens while you're gone? What if Blackwell or the sheriff decides to press the issue? Colton's expression hardened. You think they might try something? I don't know, Florence admitted. But after what Ida said, I don't trust them. Then I'll stay, Colton decided. We'll find another way to get the information. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following day, a knock at the door revealed a well-dressed man Florence didn't recognize. Mrs. Turner, he inquired politely. My name is Edward Grant, representing the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. I was hoping I might have a word. Florence glanced over her shoulder, where Colton had appeared from the barn. Of course, Mr. Grant. Please come in. The railroad man removed his hat as he entered, nodding respectfully to Colton. And you are, sir? Colton Murphy, Mrs. Turner's farm manager and business partner. Grant seemed to take this in stride. Excellent. This concerns you both, then. He accepted the offered seat at the kitchen table. I'll be direct, Mrs. Turner. Our company is planning a spur line to connect White Rock to the main Northern Pacific route. The most efficient path crosses the eastern portion of your property. Florence and Colton exchanged glances. I see, she said carefully. And you're here to discuss terms? Grant looked surprised, then pleased. Indeed. We're prepared to offer fair compensation for the right-of-way. $500 for approximately 10 acres along your eastern boundary. That seems low, Colton commented. Considering the value this line will bring to the region. Grant studied him with new interest. What did you have in mind? A lease arrangement, Colton suggested, with annual payments. The land remains Mrs. Turner's property, but the railroad has exclusive use of the right-of-way. Interesting, Grant mused. Most landowners prefer a one-time payment. Mrs. Turner isn't selling her land, Colton said firmly. Not to the railroad. Not to anyone. Grant nodded slowly. I can take this proposal back to my superiors. Though I should mention we've already secured agreements with most other affected landowners. Including James Blackwell? Florence asked. Mr. Blackwell has been most cooperative, Grant confirmed. In fact, he offered to negotiate on your behalf, given your situation. Florence straightened in her chair. My situation is perfectly sound, Mr. Grant. And I prefer to handle my own negotiations, thank you. The railroad man smiled. I can see that. Very well, Mrs. Turner. I'll present your counter-proposal. Would $20 per acre annually be acceptable? 40. Colton countered without hesitation. Grant's eyebrows rose. That's quite steep. The land includes access to White Rock Creek, essential for your steam engines, Colton pointed out. Plus, this route saves you miles of track compared to going around her property. After some back and forth, they settled on $30 per acre annually, with a review clause every 5 years. Grant promised to return within the week with formal paperwork. After he departed, Florence turned to Colton with wide eyes. Did that just happen? Colton grinned. It did. $300 a year, Florence. That's more than most farmers clear in profit. And the land stays mine, she said wonderingly. Charles would be so pleased. He'd be proud of you, Colton said, pulling her into an embrace. Standing your ground, protecting what's yours. Florence rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. What's ours, she corrected softly. If you meant what you said about staying. Colton tilted her chin up to look into her eyes. I meant every word. This place, this life we're building, it's everything I've been searching for. Even with a stubborn widow thrown into the bargain, she teased. Especially with her, he murmured, leaning down to kiss her. They were still lost in the moment when the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Florence pulled away reluctantly, moving to the window. It's Sheriff Danner, she said, her happiness dimming. And Blackwell's with him. Colton's expression hardened. Stay inside, he instructed, moving to the door. No, Florence countered, following him. This is my home. We faced them together. The two men drew their horses to a stop in front of the porch. Sheriff Danner looked irritated, while Blackwell's face was flushed with anger. Mrs. Turner, the sheriff began without preamble. Mr. Blackwell here informs me you've been interfering with official railroad business. That's not true, Florence replied calmly. I simply negotiated terms with Mr. Grant directly, rather than through intermediaries. Blackwell dismounted, his substantial frame causing the horse to snort with relief. You had no right. I had an arrangement with the railroad company. An arrangement concerning my land? Florence asked innocently. How fascinating, considering you have no authority to negotiate on my behalf. This town needs that railroad connection, Blackwell sputtered. The prosperity of everyone depends on it. And the railroad will get its connection, Colton interjected. Mrs. Turner has agreed to a right-of-way lease. The tracks will run exactly where planned. Sheriff Danner's eyes narrowed. A lease? Grant agreed to that. He did, Florence confirmed. The paperwork will be ready next week. Blackwell's face turned an alarming shade of purple. This is outrageous. I've already sold parcels based on the railroad's promises. I need control of that eastern section to develop. He stopped abruptly, realizing he'd said too much. To develop what, Mr. Blackwell? Florence asked. A new business district, perhaps? Lots for sale at premium prices, now with guaranteed railroad access. The banker's silence confirmed her suspicions. Seems to me, Colton said mildly, that you've been counting on acquiring Mrs. Turner's land cheaply to maximize your profits. That's hardly her problem to solve. Sheriff Danner stepped forward. Murphy, you're interfering in town business. This was all arranged before you arrived. Arranged? Colton repeated. Interesting choice of words for trying to swindle a widow out of her rightful property. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun. I'd watch your accusations if I were you. Florence stepped between them. Sheriff, Mr. Blackwell, the matter is settled. The railroad gets its right-of-way, the town gets its connection, and I keep my land. Everyone wins. Not everyone, Blackwell muttered darkly. That's enough, Sheriff Danner said, putting a restraining hand on Blackwell's arm. We'll discuss this further in town, James. To Florence, he added, this isn't over, Mrs. Turner. There are other ways to ensure compliance with town ordinances. As they rode away, Florence felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. What did he mean by that? Colton's expression was grim. Nothing good. We should be prepared for more trouble. They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, a group of men rode onto the property, led by a deputy Florence didn't recognize. Mrs. Turner, the deputy called. I have orders to inspect your property for compliance with territorial health and safety regulations. Florence exchanged a glance with Colton before stepping forward. This is private property, deputy. I don't recall inviting an inspection. Don't need an invitation, madam. Sheriff's orders. The deputy dismounted, followed by his companions. We'll start with the barn. For the next 2 hours, the men combed through every building on the property, making notes and exchanging meaningful glances. They measured the distance from the privy to the well, examined the chimney, and even inspected the goat pen for proper drainage. Your roof shingles are substandard, the deputy announced when they'd finished. And that barn needs additional supports to meet code. You've got 30 days to make repairs or face fines. What code? Colton demanded. There's no building code in this territory. The deputy shrugged. Town Ordinance 14B, enacted last month, applies to all properties within 5 miles of town limits. He handed Florence a paper. Here's the full list of violations. Good day, madam. After they departed, Florence unfolded the paper, her hands shaking with anger. There are 23 items on this list. Some of them are ridiculous. Fence posts must be uniform in height. Window glass must be free of imperfections. Colton took the list, his expression darkening as he read. This is harassment, plain and simple. They know we can't address all these in 30 days, not without hiring help we can't afford yet. What do we do? Florence asked. Colton considered for a moment. We prioritize the serious issues the barn supports, the roof. Ignore the trivial ones. And we seek legal advice. From who? The only lawyer in White Rock works for Blackwell. Then we go to Helena. Not just for a lawyer, but to speak with the territorial governor's office. This kind of abuse of power won't stand if brought to the right attention. Florence nodded slowly. You're right. But Helena's still days away, and one of us needs to stay here. I'll go, Colton decided. You know the property better if they come back for another inspection. The thought of being separated still troubled Florence, but she saw the necessity. When will you leave? First light tomorrow. I'll take the fastest horse and travel light. He took her hands in his. I'll be back as soon as possible. 3 days to Helena, 2 days for business, 3 days back. A week at most. That evening, as they prepared for Colton's journey, Florence felt a growing unease. I don't like this, she admitted as she packed food for his saddlebags. It feels like we're playing into their hands by separating. Maybe, Colton acknowledged. But we need allies with authority, and they're in Helena. He hesitated, then added, Florence, while I'm gone, keep your shotgun loaded and near at hand. You think they might try something? I think Blackwell has too much money invested in his scheme to give up easily. Colton's expression was grave. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise. She stepped into his embrace, drawing strength from his steady presence. You be careful too. The road to Helena has its own dangers. Their goodbye at dawn was brief but intense, a kiss that carried all the words they hadn't yet said aloud. Florence watched him ride away until he was just a speck on the horizon, then turned back to the homestead with renewed determination. She wouldn't give Blackwell or the sheriff the satisfaction of finding her helpless or afraid. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Florence tended the animals, worked in the garden, and began making the barn repairs the deputy had cited. The physical labor kept her mind occupied and her body tired enough to sleep despite her worries. On the 3rd day, Ida Johnson arrived unexpectedly, her grandson driving her wagon. Thought you might need some company, the old woman announced, climbing down with her grandson's help. And an extra pair of hands. Timothy here is handy with a hammer. Florence could have wept with gratitude. That's very kind of you both. Not kindness, neighborliness, Ida corrected. Something this town seems to have forgotten. She patted her grandson's arm. Timothy will help with those repairs. Meanwhile, you and I will put up some preserves. I brought peaches from my tree. With Timothy's help, Florence made significant progress on the barn reinforcements. By sundown, nearly half the items on the deputy's list had been addressed. You'll stay for supper? Florence asked as they finished for the day. Thank you, but no, Ida replied. Timothy needs to get me home before dark, but we'll be back tomorrow. Why are you helping me? Florence asked impulsively. Most of the town seems determined to see me fail. Ida's weathered face softened. Because 35 years ago, I was a widow trying to hold on to what my husband and I built. The town rallied around me then. I'm just returning the favor, even if I'm the only one who remembers how it should be done. As promised, Ida and Timothy returned the next day and the next. With their help, Florence completed most of the required repairs well before the 30-day deadline. Each night, she fell into bed exhausted but satisfied with their progress. On the evening of the 6th day, as Florence was putting away the last of the tools, she heard horses approaching. Her heart leaped, thinking Colton had returned early, but the sound of multiple riders dampened her hope. She reached for the shotgun leaning against the barn door. Sheriff Danner rode into view, accompanied by 4 men Florence didn't recognize. They weren't deputies. Their rough appearance and the way they carried themselves spoke of a different profession altogether. Evening, Mrs. Turner, the sheriff called, dismounting. Thought I'd check on your progress with those violations. Most are addressed, Florence replied, keeping the shotgun visible but pointed at the ground. Though you're welcome to wait until the 30 days are up for an official inspection. The sheriff smirked. That won't be necessary. I've brought some men to help you pack. Pack? Florence repeated, her grip tightening on the gun. Mr. Blackwell has purchased your outstanding tax debt from the county, Sheriff Danner explained with false sympathy. Seems your late husband was behind on payments. With penalties and interest, you owe $340, due immediately. Florence felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. Charles was meticulous about taxes. Not according to county records. The sheriff produced an official-looking document. You have until sunrise to vacate the premises. Mr. Blackwell has generously offered $50 to help you resettle in town. This is theft, Florence said, her voice shaking with anger. And you know it. One of the rough men stepped forward. Madam, we've been hired to ensure the property is vacated peaceful-like. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Florence raised the shotgun. This is my home. I'm not leaving. The men exchanged glances, and the sheriff sighed dramatically. Florence, be reasonable. You're outnumbered. Murphy's not here to help you. Just take the offer and leave with dignity. How did you know Colton was gone? Florence demanded, suddenly understanding. You were watching, waiting for him to leave. The sheriff shrugged. Doesn't matter. What matters is you're alone, and you're leaving one way or another. Florence cocked the shotgun. I may be alone, but I'm not helpless. The first man who steps onto my porch gets buckshot in his chest. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of the men laughed nervously. Sheriff, you didn't say nothing about getting shot at. This ain't worth what Blackwell's paying. Shut up, the sheriff hissed. To Florence, he said, you can't stay awake forever, Mrs. Turner. We'll be back, and next time, the sound of approaching riders interrupted him. From the road came 6 mounted men, led by Timothy Johnson. Florence recognized some of the others as farmers from outlying homesteads. Everything all right, Mrs. Turner? Timothy called, his hand resting meaningfully on the rifle in his saddle holster. Sheriff was just leaving. Florence replied, not lowering her shotgun. Sheriff Danner's face darkened as he took in the newcomers. This is official county business, boys. You do well to ride on. Funny, said one of the farmers, an older man named Peterson. I was at the county office last week paying my own taxes. Saw the rolls myself. Turners were paid up through next year. Must be a different record, the sheriff insisted, though less confidently. Or a false one, Timothy suggested. Grandma thought something like this might happen. That's why she sent me to round up some neighbors. The sheriff glanced at his hired men, clearly calculating the odds. This isn't over, he warned Florence. Blackwell won't stop until he gets what he wants. Then he'll be waiting a very long time, Florence replied steadily. This land isn't for sale, not to him, not to anyone. After the sheriff and his men departed, Florence thanked Timothy and the others profusely. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't arrived. Probably shot someone, Peterson said with a chuckle. Looks like you had things well in hand. But I'd have thought you might appreciate some company tonight, just in case they come back. 2 of the men volunteered to stay, setting up camp near the barn. Their presence allowed Florence to sleep soundly for the first time since Colton's departure. The next morning brought the welcome sound of a single rider approaching at speed. Florence rushed outside to see Colton dismounting from his exhausted horse, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Florence," he called, striding toward her. "Are you all right? I met Peterson on the road. He told me what happened." She flew into his arms, the fear and tension of the past week dissolving in his embrace. "I'm fine, thanks to Ida and her grandson and the neighbors." Colton held her tight, his heart pounding against hers. "I shouldn't have left you." "You did what was necessary," Florence assured him. "Did you find help in Helena?" Colton smiled, producing an official-looking document from his saddlebag. "Better than that. I brought the U.S. Marshal." A second rider appeared on the road, a stern-faced man wearing a silver star on his vest. "Mrs. Turner," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Marshal James Cooper. I understand you've had some trouble with your local law enforcement." Over coffee in Florence's kitchen, they explained everything: the railroad negotiations, Blackwell's schemes, the sheriff's harassment, and the false tax claim. "Not the first time I've heard complaints about White Rock," the marshal commented. "But this is blatant enough to warrant immediate action." He stood. "I'll be paying Sheriff Danner and Mr. Blackwell a visit. In the meantime, this writ from the territorial governor's office should prevent any further harassment." After the marshal departed, Florence turned to Colton. "Do you think it will really stop them?" "A federal marshal tends to cool even the hottest heads," Colton assured her. "And if not, we have other news." He produced another document. "The railroad lease is official. I met with Mr. Grant and Helena and finalized the terms. $30 per acre, paid annually, first payment in advance." He handed her an envelope. $300, Florence. Enough to hire help for the harvest and buy more livestock." Florence stared at the money in amazement. "I never thought. When Charles and I came here, we barely had enough to build the cabin. And now you're a landowner partnering with the Northern Pacific Railroad," Colton said with a smile. "Your husband would be proud." "Our partnership goes beyond the land," Florence said softly, meeting his eyes. "These past weeks without you made something very clear to me, Colton. I don't want to be alone anymore." Colton took her hands. "Florence Turner, from the moment I saw you standing up to that sheriff, I knew you were special. I came to Montana looking for a place to call home, but I found something far more precious." He hesitated, then continued, "I know it's soon. I know people will talk, but I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to build a life with you right here." "Are you proposing, Mr. Murphy?" Florence asked, her heart racing. "I am," he confirmed, his blue eyes steady on hers. "Will you marry me, Florence?" "Yes," she whispered, joy bubbling up inside her. "Yes, I will." Their kiss sealed the promise, sweet and sure, a new beginning built on shared dreams and mutual respect. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Ida Johnson's garden, with Reverend Phillips officiating. Despite the short notice, nearly half the town attended, a sign that the tide of opinion was turning. Marshal Cooper's investigation had already resulted in Sheriff Danner's suspension pending a full inquiry, and James Blackwell's sudden interest in business opportunities in Idaho. Florence wore a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her make the previous year, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Colton, freshly shaven and wearing a new shirt, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Timothy Johnson's arm. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Phillips began, "we are gathered here to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As they exchanged vows, Florence thought of Charles, his dream for this land, his love that had brought her west, his memory that would always be part of her. But her heart was full of the present too, and the future stretching before her with the man whose steady gaze promised partnership, respect, and love. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Colton's kiss was gentle but full of promise, and the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. Even Margaret Wells managed a tight smile as she offered congratulations. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing in Ida's yard. As darkness fell, Florence found herself sitting beside her new husband on a bench beneath an apple tree, watching their neighbors laugh and dance. "Happy?" Colton asked, his arm around her shoulders. More than I ever thought possible again, Florence admitted. When Charles died, I thought my life was over. Then I lost Martha, and it seemed like the world was determined to take everything from me. And now, she leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his presence. Now I understand that life doesn't end with loss. It changes, transforms. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to keep going, it offers second chances. Colton kissed her temple. To second chances, then, and new beginnings. To us, Florence agreed. And to our home. 1 year later, Florence stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Colton work with 2 hired hands to bring in the wheat harvest. The fields that had been overgrown when they met now stretched golden under the Montana sun, promising their best yield yet. Inside, their 3-month-old daughter Clara slept peacefully in the cradle Colton had carved during the winter evenings. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, already making her presence known with lusty cries and captivating smiles. The railroad spur line had been completed the previous month, bringing increased commerce to White Rock and regular shipments to markets in the east. Florence and Colton's farm had prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful in the county. As Colton looked up from his work and waved, Florence felt a surge of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought him to her homestead that day when the sheriff had called her worthless. How wrong he had been, and how right Colton was when he declared her his whole world. She was no longer the grieving widow struggling to survive. She was a wife, a mother, a successful landowner, a woman who had faced loss and emerged stronger, who had found love when she least expected it, and built a new life from the ashes of the old. As she waved back to her husband, Clara stirring against her shoulder, Florence knew that this land, this love, this family was everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to hope for. This was home, and it was worthless to no one.